Today I'm going to build another bed, this time for my daughter, who gave me 3 guidelines to follow when designing her bed. 1, she wanted it to be low down to the ground. 2, she wanted big, round, chunky legs. And 3, she wanted it to be a light colored wood. I went through a few design iterations, tweaking parts here and there until I landed on this one. Going with my daughter's 3rd demand of using a light colored wood, I chose white oak from Woodworker Source, where everything I needed was delivered right to my home, and all I needed to do was rip all the boards to final width and length eventually. Since this bed is for her, she wanted to be involved in the whole process, so we spent quite a while deciding the layout for the headboard. Then I spent some time jointing some of the edges that weren't lining up the way I would like. Since all these boards were already milled to final thickness and I was going to be gluing them up in one fell swoop, I decided to use dominoes to make sure they were really well aligned. Using a straight edge, my daughter made lines to use as a guide for lining up the domino. When cutting, I made sure one half of the joint was an exact size slot, and for the other half of the joint, I switched to the oversized setting to allow for some slop, just in case we didn't cut directly on her perfect lines. She said she had so much fun using the domino, and then I scarred her for life when we were doing the glue up.
First one I can take a little.
No, come on. You have to think fast. Just go, doesn't matter, just go. Get glued all the holes, come on. Too slow, you gotta be quicker than that. Quicker. Not funny, this isn't a funny situation. Too slow. Too slow.
The glue isn't.
We only have 20 minutes. 20 minutes till the glue sets up. Maybe I should have switched to a glue with a longer open time so we can enjoy this process without the stress. Regardless, we got it done within the 20 minutes, and now she has a little taste of the hard work and stress that actually goes into a big build like this. Moving along to her second request, the big, round, chunky legs. These legs are going to be 4 inches in diameter, so I'll need to glue up material to make them that big. First, I rough cut some pieces to length at my new fancy miter saw. Then I ripped them into strips larger than 4 inches, so I had some wiggle room with the glue up. I wanted to try and make it seem like it's actually one big block of wood and not a glue up, so each leg consists of 3 pieces. To get the most seamless look, I took the middle piece from each consecutive cut and flipped it end for end, then placed it in the middle of the stack. This way the edges have the same looking grain and the ends have this nice book-matched sort of pattern. The bed only needs 4 of these feet, but the processes I'm going to use to make them round and cut the joinery are, I don't want to say sketchy, but maybe they're error-prone processes, and I want to make sure I have an extra in case any mistakes happen. So I glued up all the blanks at one time and trimmed them up after the glue dried. I was able to get the edges flat using the table saw and planer. Watching this footage now, I don't really remember why I put that taller auxiliary fence on my table saw, but I'm sure I had a good reason at the time. Anyway, I wanted to get these blocks as close to 4 inches as possible, so I still needed to trim up the faces, and I made sure to remove an equal amount on both sides of the block so the glue seams wouldn't be off center. Then I cut them all to length using the crosscut sled. I'm going to make these round using a table saw lathe. So I marked the center on the end of each blank by drawing 2 diagonal lines from opposite corners and marking the point where they meet with an awl. To make it easier on my table saw lathe, I decided to knock off all the corners by making bevel cuts at the table saw. Then this happened. I have made this type of cut a billion times before and never had this happen. When I posted about it on Instagram, someone suggested I watch a video by Stumpy Nubs where this happened to him as well, and he explains why it may have happened. So I'll add that link in the description box if you're interested. The show must go on, so I did a quick wardrobe change and prepared the blanks for turning by drilling a hole on all the center marks from earlier and installed a flat top grind blade in my table saw. From the research I've done, people have better success using this type of blade on their table saw lathes. The idea for this jig came from none other than Izzy Swan. I saw a video where he talks about how this is actually a super safe method for turning blanks, so I'll link that down below as well. I couldn't find any plans for his build though, so I had to keep pausing his video to see how his worked and just wing it. Here are the basics. A blank of wood is held firmly in place by threaded rods rotating through bearings that were placed in holes that are in line with each other on opposite ends of the jig. The threaded rods are locked into place with nuts, and the nut on the front is used with a nut driver in a drill to rotate the blank through the bearings as the whole jig is pushed toward a spinning blade at a super high speed. Got it? So in order to get the correct blade height, I just kept raising the blade until there were no more flat spots on the blank, and the jig was also great for easy sanding because there were definitely blade marks right off the jig. Once the blade height was set though, I could cut the rest of the blanks in one pass. I know this looks super sketchy, but making those bevel cuts earlier were actually way sketchier than using this jig. I don't have a real lathe to compare this process to, but I would venture to say this method is quicker and more accurate. A few things about the jig. I made it adjustable in length because I plan on using it to make large table legs soon. The bar running along the sides is to make sure the hole in the adjustable back piece is always level with the front portion of the jig for straight cuts. This part could be modified to make tapered cuts if you like. And lastly, because I know it's going to be asked, I removed the throat plate on the saw so there was better dust collection. This whole process was crazy satisfying. Now time to cut the joinery. I'm going to use what's called a castle joint to connect all these parts. The bed rails, headboard, and footboard will lock into each other using a crosslap. Then that crosslap will lock into an X shape or a plus shape that's cut in the feet, kind of like an intersecting bridle joint. It's always easier to cut joinery in square stock, so I had to make a jig to trick the rounds into thinking they were square. Basically, I made a box where the inside dimensions were the exact size of the diameter of the round feet. When placing the feet in those boxes, I made sure the glue lines were running straight up and down, parallel to the sides of the jig, and made sure the bottoms were flush with the bottom of the jig. After clamping in place, I locked them down with a few screws at the top in an area I knew was going to be cut off after all the joinery was done. If you're asking yourself, why does the box only have 3 sides? There is no other reason other than I ran out of 1/2" MDF and this was all I had. But as it turns out, a 4th side wasn't even necessary. You'll see. Now this was super exciting. I finally have a saw that can hold a Dado Stack. I made a real quick and dirty tenoning jig that rides along the table saw fence and set it in position using a scrap of MDF that was cut to the dimensions of the round feet with layout lines on it. This is where I was happy I made that extra foot because I was able to do a test cut without too much worry. Since it was my first time using a Dado Stack like this though, I was worried about cutting too much material off at one time, so I just kept raising the blade until I couldn't raise it anymore. Then rotated the whole workpiece and repeated the same process to the other side. You can see here that a 4th side of the box wasn't even necessary because I only needed to reference one side of each cut since the blade was set up to cut perfectly on the center of these pieces. It may have been easier to cut all this before I made them round, but I was concerned about tear out on the cuts. I could have filled in the cuts temporarily before turning them to avoid that, but it was my first time using the table saw lathe, and I didn't want to introduce any other variables into that crazy situation. There is no right way, just the way that works for you at the time that you're doing it. Anyway, an 8-inch Dado Stack can only cut about 2.5 inches deep, and these joints need to be about 4¼ inches deep to fit the width of the bed rails. So I needed to extend those cuts. Lots of methods crossed my mind. This is what I settled on. First, I rough cut the rest at the bandsaw, which you might think I could have just done from the start without the use of the Dado Stack and tenoning jig, and you're right. But I like that I had those 2 perfect cuts to use as a reference for what I'm going to do next, which is make a template. I used the shaper origin to make the exact size shape that's needed for the joint, but in a bit I'll show you how to do this without this magic tool. I placed the template on with double-sided tape, using that first perfect Dado Stack cut as a reference to make sure I was lining it up correctly, then used a pattern bit to clean up the portion that was cut with the bandsaw. I kept lowering the bit as far as I could go, then removed the template and used the cleaned up surface as a reference for the bearing to clean it up even further. Now remember I said I ran out of 1/2" MDF to make the 4th sides for those boxes? Well, the only material I had left to make this template on the origin was not wide enough to be placed on that 4th open side. So I took it as an opportunity to show you how to make the template without the origin. To make a template for any opening, You need at least 3 pieces where the center piece is the exact size of the opening you need, and then you just glue them together and clamp with painter's tape. Super simple. Now I could repeat the process on this open side just like before, lower the bit till it can't go any further, remove template, and cut once more. It was pretty awesome to have the wide base of my 6-in-1 trim router jig to span the opening here, and FYI, they are finally back in stock, so I'll add the link down below so you can check it out. Looking inside the joint, you can see that the router was not able to remove all the material, so I cleaned up the rest with a chisel. And I'm sure this goes without saying, but this whole process could have just been done with a handsaw and a chisel too. I just prefer the power tool route, but you do you. At this point, I didn't need square references anymore, so I freed the rounds from their square cages by cutting them to final length using a miter gauge and stop block. Routers always leave round corners, so the last step in making this part of the joint was to square up all the bottoms, and the feet are done. Moving on to the crosslaps that will go into the joint I just cut. I started with the footboard. The hardest part of all this is making sure you're making it the right size for the mattress. A queen size mattress is 80 inches long by 60 inches wide. So I know the distance between the inner edges of the crosslaps need to be slightly longer than 60 inches on the footboard to accommodate the mattress. Then I took that template I made earlier for the feet, cut it so the opening was cut approximately in half, and used that to mark the rest of the joint, which I rough cut with my favorite tool, the jigsaw. If you couldn't tell, I really love working with templates because of the simplicity and perfection in the results. I used double-sided tape and a square to place it down perfectly and made sure to flip the workpiece over because I'm using my actual favorite tool and favorite flush trim bit that has a bearing on the bottom to clean up the joint and make it perfect. These joints were laid out in reference to each other to accommodate the size of the mattress, not from the ends of the board, which were not cut to final length just yet. To get that final length, I placed the foot on the joint, measured about 1 inch away from the side of the foot, then measured how far that line was from the edge of the joint, and transferred that measurement to the other side of the board so I could cut to final length on both those lines. Moving right along to these side rails, which I ripped to width and cut to length now that I knew how much extra room I would need to stick out from the joint based on the footboard. This joint is going to be slightly different. The joints on the footboard were on the bottom. The joint on the side rails need to be on the top so they can lock together. But based on my design, there's an angled cut towards the end of the board, making the end narrower. So this angled cut needs to be done before cutting in the joinery. I contemplated for a bit on how to make this cut. I considered the table saw, but decided template was the way to go. I placed a piece of MDF on the angled line I drew, then used a square referencing the straight edge of the workpiece to mark another angle that I can use to line up the miter saw, and cut. I have no idea what degree angle this cut is, and it doesn't matter as long as it lines up. I glued another piece of MDF to that cut end and added a third piece so the whole template is the same width of the board. This way I can line up the bottom of this template with the bottom corner of all the boards, and the cuts will all be the same. I rough cut all the ends of the side rails with the jigsaw and figured while I was already cutting this angle on these parts, I would cut it on the footboard that will need it as well. Notice how the joint on the footboard is on the bottom, so it was fine doing this part after. When flush trimming these parts, I had to be mindful of grain direction. Because you move the router from left to right, I always wanted to make sure I was placing the template on the correct side, so I was running down the angled cut with the grain and not the other way around, up the angled cut against the grain, which would cause tear out. Again, using my favorite bit, I was able to quickly clean up all these parts. Just a side note regarding the design. These angles are not just aesthetic. There's a purposeful reason why I designed it this way, and that is to make changing a fitted sheet easier. You'll see at the end, I was kind of excited when I thought of this idea. Once clean, I could do the same process for the cross laps as I did on the footboard, only this time I had to make the opening on the top of the board where I just made those angles. The headboard has the same configuration as the footboard, so I used the already cut footboard as the template to mark out the joints. I rough cut with a jigsaw, then clamped the footboard in place to use as the template for routing. The bit I like to use has the bearing on the bottom, so in this moment I thought it was wise for me to clamp the template to the top and flip the whole heavy headboard onto some clamps as support. Now, judging by how dark it is outside, I was doing this process pretty late at night, and I probably should not do that in the future. As I'm reviewing this footage after a fresh cup of coffee, I'm wondering, why didn't I just clamp the template to the bottom? Work harder, not smarter, I guess. Anyway, the following day I trimmed the headboard to final size with a track saw and cut a rough curve on the upper corners. I wanted these corners to have a 4-inch radius, so I quickly cut a template with the origin and their new feature, Auto Pass, where you can just keep cutting with each pass and you don't have to set your depth after every cut. It's pretty cool. And Fresh Cup of Coffee Me placed this template on the underside to clean up the corners. Then I sanded everything nice and smooth for hours and hours and hours. Off camera, I decided to do a test fit of all the parts. And I knocked off a corner on one of the joints when I tried to disassemble it. I managed to find the piece that broke off and I glued it back on with CA glue and painter's tape. After assembling the parts again, which is really satisfying because they fit so nicely, I sanded everything flush and it looks a lot better. Not perfect, but better. Oh well. With my woodworker source delivery, I also got a bunch of poplar, which I decided to use for the support slats. Using plywood or pine just didn't feel right on a bed like this, and ordering from Woodworker Source is super easy. If you don't know how much board footage you need for a project, you can plug in your size requirements and they will automatically calculate the board footage for you. They send more than enough for you to mill your parts, which is what I'm doing with the poplar now. I just need to rip the pieces into strips, then cut them to length. The slats will rest on side rail supports, and I was able to get the correct location for these supports by placing cutoffs from the slats I just milled up on the side rails using double-sided tape. Why measure and mess with numbers when this is just so much easier, for me at least? The slats will also rest on a center rail support. In the past, I used center rail hardware, but given that this bed doesn't have any hardware in it, I decided to go the joinery route again. I cut up 2 big chunks of scrap white oak and made a dado the size of the center rail. Why didn't I use a dado stack now that I have one? Because now that I have one, I realize how annoying it is to switch out to the dado stack, and I won't be doing that whole to-do for one cut. Batching out stuff, sure. One dado? Nope. I was still able to get super clean cuts by using my Cat's Moses router plane, and I can attach these to the headboard and footboard. Again, why measure when you can use your actual workpieces as a reference? But that doesn't look right. All right, this support goes under the slats. Once clamped in the correct position, I glue the support blocks in place. Super easy. The center rail will get additional support with these feet. And here comes the first bit of hardware on this build. On my last bed build, I explained that in order for a screw to have better holding power in end grain, you can glue a dowel through its edge or face. So that's what I'm doing with these center rail support feet. I countersunk holes in the center rail support the same distance from the edge that I glued in those dowels, then glued and screwed the feet in place. You can see here that the screw is going to bite into the edge of the dowel I glued in, making this connection in end grain a lot stronger. I thought this build was going to be a no hardware build, but since I just ruined that with a center rail, I decided to reinforce the rest of the supports with screws as well. I felt like the headboard also needed some support from the back, so I milled up 3 more pieces and cut a bunch of domino mortises in them. Some of these will be used to connect these pieces to each other. Others will be used to connect the support to the headboard using buttons. I cut mortises in the ends of some poplar slats, glued dominoes in place, then glued those slats to the support uprights. Just like on my last bed, this back support is going to do double duty. It supports the headboard while also acting as a bookshelf. To attach this shelf to the uprights, I drilled holes at the drill press, then made sure the top shelf was aligned with the uprights and continued that hole through the end grain of the uprights. I then added glue and locked all the parts together with a dowel. It's always really fun to cut dowels flush like this. I mentioned before that some of the domino slots I cut in those upright supports were for connecting this support to the headboard with buttons. So next up, I had to make those buttons. I covered this whole topic on my 8 ways to attach a tabletop video, where I went into detail on how to make these, why we make these, and all that jazz. All you need to do is make a rabbet on the end of the board, and it's best to use the widest board you can so you can get a lot of buttons. Or you could utilize both ends of smaller scraps like this. Then you cut the board into strips so they're slightly narrower than the slot you cut, drill some countersunk holes in them while they're still easy to hold, then cut them to final size using a miter gauge or crosscut sled. Time for all the final touches. I eased all the edges with a block plane and sanded where that couldn't reach. I did this while it was assembled as not to sand any parts of the joints that need to be square and flush. Then I disassembled everything very carefully this time so I don't knock off any more corners, and did some more final shaping. A big round over on the headboard, chamfers on the side rails at the request of my daughter, and a big round over on the bottom of the feet. For the finish, I went with OSMO Raw. This finish is perfect for light colored woods because there's a slight white pigment added to it. If you've ever used something like a tung oil on white oak, you know that it gets really orange, so the white pigment here prevents that from happening. It's also super forgiving in the application process. Just pour a little on, buff it in with a white buffing pad, then wipe off the excess. But it does require 2 coats. In between those coats, let's take a break with Green Chef, the sponsor of today's video. Green Chef is a CCOF certified organic meal kit company with options for every lifestyle like keto and paleo, vegan, vegetarian, fast and fit, Mediterranean, or gluten-free. You may have seen me make wholesome and delicious dinners from Green Chef for my family in the past. Recently, I decided I need to eat healthier lunches for myself. It's always hard to pause in the middle of the day, and I would often resort to a protein bar or sometimes just snacking. But Green Chef makes it so easy to maintain a healthier lifestyle because most of the hard work is done for you. The meal kits include pre-made and pre-measured sauces, dressings, and spices, all delivered right to your door, so you can get more chef-curated flavor in less time. I love receiving the seasonal organic produce that can be made into restaurant-quality dishes, and best part, Green Chef is constantly changing things up with their easy-to-follow recipes, so there's something new to discover every week, and I never get bored. Something I didn't know, Green Chef is the only meal kit company that offers keto meals. And just in time for New Year's, they're introducing an easier way to eat keto with their new limited time Keto Kickoff 2023, where you can order keto meals for breakfast and dinner. To be honest, I had to look up what the keto diet is, so you can try this out if you're curious like me, or if it's a lifestyle you already love. You can find more delicious keto options than ever before, including recipes on the menu, as well as meal bundles in the green market. Now time to enjoy this wholesome, delicious lunch I whipped up in no time as I marvel over this big project I just completed. If you're interested in trying out Green Chef for yourself, you can use my code 3x3custom60 to get 60% off plus free shipping. Go to greenchef.com for more details. Once again, go to greenchef.com and use the code 3x3custom60 to get 60% off plus free shipping. Finish is dry, time to assemble it in her room. To make assembly easy now and potentially in the future, I labeled all the parts on inconspicuous areas, and now that all the hard work is done, the kids want to help again. All joking aside, that's what's so awesome about building a bed with this sort of joinery. The kids were able to really visualize how things went together, and it was so fun to hear their thoughts on the whole process. I tried my best to just stand back and watch them figure it out, but there were a few tips I could offer them, like how to properly align the joints with a scrap before assembling the whole thing. My son called me smart for that one. Anyway, this joinery is like a puzzle, and it's just a matter of lining everything up in the right order. They started with the side rails because the open portion of the cross lap was facing up. Then locked the 2 side rails together with the footboard that has the open portion of the cross lap on the bottom. Some of the joints slipped right into place, others needed a bit of persuading, but this seemed like it was really fun for them, and boy was it satisfying for me to see those joints line up perfectly. The headboard has the same configuration as the footboard, with the joints cut out on the bottom, and again, that fit. Such a relief when it all snaps into place. Not done yet, kiddos. We still need to attach the back support to the headboard. This is where the buttons come into play. You can see how they fit into the slots cut with the Domino and how this stiffens the whole headboard to make it more sturdy. My kids love using the drill whenever helping with these projects. Next up is the center rail support. It drops into place on the support blocks I made, then it gets locked down with screws through countersunk holes. The support slats go on last, on top of the center rail support, resting on the side rail supports. I made a spacer to make this step really easy for her. She just had to line up the boards with the spacer in between and lock them all down with screws. A celebratory high five, and it's done. Time to load it up with a mattress and test it out. She's happy, so I'm happy. She wanted this bookshelf just like I made for her little brother, and I love this feature too. I also just love how the castle joint looks with the round leg. I don't think I've ever seen it done this way before, but it's totally something I would do again. Now for the angles cut out on all the rails. It's kind of a mix between a platform bed and a regular bed. I don't really like platform beds because the mattress can slide. The high points on the rails prevent the mattress from moving, but you still get the benefit of being able to easily change fitted sheets with that angled cut. Also something I've never seen before, and it's definitely a concept I would play around with more. I'd say with the parameters given to me, I did a pretty good job. It's a light colored, low bed with round chunky legs that looks cool and is super solid. I got to learn a ton on this build, which is great, but even better, I got to teach my kids as they helped throughout the project, so this was a huge win for me. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.
Proud of yourself?
I am actually.
I just wanted to hug you.
You just wanted to hug me? I'll take a hug any day.